because they were coming to the same meeting. Otherwise, both of them would have driven, and that makes the emissions more. Sindio? So hiyo ni example. Wale wenye mlipikia makaa tumewaona. Chocolate inakuja. Nimeiteko. Chocolate mtu asikize. Okay, so beyond the NDC, so members, unajua mtapoteza, and we have a quiz at the end. So if you don't listen, those who are talking to each other, I'm just seeing you. I pity you. So in terms of implementing the NDC, our key instrument as a country that implements the NDC is the National Climate Change Action Plan, because we have actions there for mitigation, adaptation that endeavor to reduce those emissions. But before that, of course, we recognize the Climate Change Act of 2016 that mandates the inclusion of vulnerable and marginalized groups in climate policies and processes. There's also aspects of gender mainstreaming within the Climate Change Act, which include, among others, coming up with a national gender and intergenerational civic education strategy and implementation program. It's a very long name. But I think the key in that long name is the first fact that we are integrating gender, but also ensuring that our aspirations cut across generations. And that's why the CEO earlier was talking about children. So even as we talk about interventions, how are children involved, how are the young people involved, men, women, etc. So I've talked about the National Climate Change Act that is the instrument for implementation of the NDC. And so even as we come up with the National Gender and Climate Change Action Plan, we shall not be moving so much away from these key frameworks, because, okay, we are not duplicating, but we are just looking at the various commitments as a country and ensuring that we have effectively mainstreamed gender and inclusivity across board. Other instruments include the National Adaptation Plan. You can see the adaptation plan is specific on adaptation, which stresses the importance of addressing the unique vulnerabilities of women and marginalized groups, and promotes gender-sensitive climate adaptation across all the sectors. The adaptation plan also focuses quite a bit on rural populations, because you know that within adaptation actions, agriculture features very prominently. And most of our agriculture is undertaken in the rural areas. That's why the focus on rural populations. But even as we look at rural, I think it's good to look at the various intersections in terms of men, women, persons with disabilities, children, marginalized, etc. And of course, I can be fired if I don't mention the National Policy on Gender and Development of 2019. That is also our national policy framework as regards matters gender, and focuses on mainstreaming gender across sectors, among them the environment. So when you look at our policy, there is a section dedicated to matters environment, and just ensuring that they cut across all the sectors. So in terms of the policy framework, I feel those are important for you to note, not to say that they're exhaustive, but for now, I think we can work with that. So in terms of policy integration, there are also quite a number of ongoing processes at national level, some of which you might be aware of and some of which might be foreign. Is our colleague from the National Treasury here? Ulifika? Ama linipigia tu ile ya kunifurahisha. Anyone from National Treasury? Imagine he called me. Anyway, not to throw them under the bus, but the National Treasury is spearheading quite some important processes in the country, and if they are not here, sio kwa ubaya, they are carrying a heavy load to sort out our economy. But the National Treasury has a climate change unit, and so you can see that climate change is at the heart of every institution. And actually, in the Climate Change Act, there is a provision that every government institution, ministries, departments, agencies are supposed to put in place climate change units to coordinate matters climate change within their institutions or sectors. And so even within the State Department, we have one. So if you're here and your institution doesn't have, then you're not abiding by our law, the Climate Change Act. And it would be good that even with amongst the non-state actors, the private sector, that's something that you can also emulate, because it helps to have a coordinated way of addressing climate change issues. So there is a process being spearheaded by the National Treasury's Climate Change Unit to come up with a national climate finance strategy, just to see, because there are quite a number of climate finance sources, and sometimes you find that accessibility is an issue. Even just information on where these funds are or where from, how you can access them is an issue. So it's important as a country to have a strategy, including of even mobilizing those resources. So they've been at the forefront of doing that, and we've been part and parcel of that process. Alongside that, they're also developing a climate finance capacity building module. So just to synthesize and break down this information in very palatable ways that anybody can, look at, or rather benefit from the training and be able to access these finances at local but also at global level. Then I've mentioned about updating of the Kenya's nationally determined contributions, which is due in February 2025, which is also, it's a process being spearheaded by the Ministry of Environment and supported by our able colleagues from GIZ. Thank you very much. They are very passionate about this, and they've really been supporting the government. Then we are also with support from Agnes, the African Group of Expert Negotiators support, at the tail end of a study that started last year, the National Gender and Climate Vulnerabilities Hotspot Mapping. The outcomes of this report will be very critical as even we develop our national action plan, because we should be addressing those vulnerabilities. And so if there's a study that has pointed us to some of this, although it wasn't looking at all the sectors, it was focused on agriculture, energy and water sectors. Of course, those are very climate reliant sectors, but at least that is information to start from, even as we spread across the other sectors. And then, of course, development of the Gender and Climate Change Action Plan, which we have talked about. And finally, current goings on of preparations for the coming COP29 conference in Baku in November. And of course, I mentioned earlier that there have been regional strategy meetings at Africa level. There is a current national planning workshop going on, and even this meeting is part of these preparations, and we hope that at the end of the day we'll get some contributions that will enrich that process, since a few of us who are here will be proceeding to that meeting after this. Mko sawa? Mko nini kabisa? Aya. So, allow me to just briefly highlight, put a bit of emphasis on the UNFCCC process, because it's both important but also very current. So, this year, as I mentioned earlier, is critical because we are supposed to embark or rather get a COP decision on the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan. So once the current one lapses, we are supposed to get a decision as to whether we are coming up with a new framework or otherwise. Of course, the aspiration for most of us, actually all parties, would like to see a continued framework to coordinate matters gender and climate change in the UNFCCC framework. So the Gender Action Plan that is lapsing this year was adopted at COP25 in Madrid, and it had a 5-year work plan that is ending, and therefore the need to embark on getting a new one. There's also within the COP25 decision on gender, the UNFCCC Secretariat was requested to always produce an annual report, an annual gender composition report. So this annual gender composition report usually is detailed, including as detailed as looking at the representation. Although I think the focus has been largely on looking at representation of men and women without really disaggregating who these men and women are. Are they young? Are they with disabilities and all that? So as it is now, mostly it's just along the lines of sex. So it looks at the party delegations, like the composition. For instance, when you have the Kenya delegation, what is the representation of men and women? How many of all parties participating, how many delegations are led by women, for example, and men, just making those comparisons, specifically to look at the progress in terms of women's participation in the climate agenda. As I said, it is focused on women, of course, for obvious historical reasons, but as we move along, I think there's need for that desegregation so that we know, aspects of inclusion. So at this COP, as I've mentioned, we are looking forward to having a final review resulting into a decision as to whether we have another framework of either 5 years or 10 years. There are proposals to have a 10-year program as opposed to 5, because the parties feel that 5 years are too short if you have to have a midterm review and all that. And like for this ending action plan, remember there was COVID in between. So it was really tight, even without having implemented all the activities because of the challenges of COVID. And then now it's ending when many parties feel like they had really not been grounded in terms of implementation. So I think I'll try to go fast. Timekeeper, am I beyond? Yeah, so just to look a bit backwards from COP28, where was COP28? In Dubai. Hey, I'm wasting Sahara. Yes, so COP28 was in Dubai, and in regards to gender, of course, the COP decision was to encourage the final review of the action plan, which will then inform a new decision. Now, that final review started in Bonn in June this year. Again, for those of you new to this UNFCCC process, there are usually 2 key conferences every year. So in June, there's always a conference in Bonn, Germany, which is the headquarters of the UNFCCC, and that is usually, it's called the SPs. I won't go into the technical terminologies because we'll be more confused. But it is the technical negotiations, mid-year technical negotiations in preparation for the conference of parties, the COP, at the end of the year. So this year in June, that final review started, and out of that final review, the negotiators came up with draft text that will inform negotiations at COP29 in Baku. So usually that is usually the chronology of events. The technical negotiators start in June, and then now, because COP is usually a policy level conference, and that is why heads of states and ministers meet there to make those policy decisions. But before that, in just earlier this month, in early September, there was a conference in Arusha called one of the bodies of the UNFCCC, called the Standing Committee on Finance. And this is the committee usually responsible to advise the finance mechanisms of the UNFCCC. Which finance mechanisms do you know? This one for sure, Tapata chocolate. Which finance mechanisms are you aware of for, at UNFCCC level? Which stands for? Yes. Huh?
Global climate.
Yes. Global Climate Fund, GCF. Which other one? Loss and Damage Fund, which is relatively new. Adaptation Fund. LDCs, yes, Least Developed Countries Fund, which is a subset of GCF. Which other one? Tumeacha moja. Na wenye mko ChatGPT ninawaona. We are analog but we know. Adaptation Fund has been said. There's one more remaining. GEF. Yes. Hiyo simu umeshika ni? Okay. Yes. Yes, so we have the GEF, which is the Global Environment Facility. It's good to know these things. And actually, when you go to their website, you might actually see a window that is calling for various stakeholders to apply for these funds. So it's good for us to know. And as I mentioned earlier, the National Treasury is in the process of coming up with that training module on climate finance, and it will be breaking down these funds among others so that we are more knowledgeable on even how to access them. So let's be very alert as institutions, both the government and non-state and even social groupings or other structures within which we drive our climate action. So the Standing Committee on Finance, which advises these financial mechanisms, had a conference, and look at the topic. See, inaka wanatujali, accelerating climate action and resilience through gender responsive financing. So it was important that the Secretariat felt that the Standing Committee on Finance as an advisory body to financial mechanism needs to be sensitized about gender issues and the importance of having gender at the back of their minds as they make those critical decisions on matters climate finance, so that then the benefits reach the real beneficiaries. Okay? So also for those of you who have been keen, this year's COP is actually focused on issues climate finance. So it was important that this readies the discussions, especially ensuring that they are gender responsive and address the special needs and realities of men and women across board. I mentioned about there having been a regional strategy workshop last week, which is also in preparation for COP. So that those are some of the decisions that some of the goings on that have been there. I'm almost finishing. I can see Winnie. I'm a Songa Karibu. So expectations at this COP. So in terms of expectations, of course, that decision to further the work on gender and climate change is very important. So as negotiators, we are looking at how best we can negotiate so that there is little contention in terms of the texts that we will come up with, so that then we get a decision. Ordinarily, during negotiations, we face challenges, especially from developed country parties who do not want issues of finance in the text. Yet, ushakuwa na mpango bila budget. Hata nyumbani. Akipata mpango ya kando inataka budget. Okay. I didn't see that coming. Everything, yes. Mpaka kuna wimbo about no romance without finance. Yes. So imagine if romance cannot happen without finance, how can climate action happen without finance? Yeah. So those are some of the expectations that we are looking forward to. A work program that will be explicit on resourcing, as opposed to the one that is ending that was a bit ambiguous. So you find that most of the achievements were actually by the UNFCCC Secretariat and at party level, based on economic standing by different parties. You find there are some that did well in implementing the activities, while some lagged behind or did not, totally did not achieve much. So that is our aspirations. And then some of the reference documents that we shall be reviewing even as we prepare for COP is the gender composition report that I mentioned about. It's annual. So looking at how we are doing, and then now coming up with proposals on how to enhance participation where it's lagging behind, and all that, and then looking at the outcome of the final review of how we did in terms of implementing the last gender action plan, so that then the one that is coming up is well informed. I just want to mention something about the gender composition report, the 2024 one, some of the key highlights. So overall, I think there's a general appreciation of gender, including inclusion of women in climate action, especially in the structures within the UNFCCC. So you have some bodies that are doing well in terms of representation of both men and women. There are some that are still lagging behind. But the most interesting thing is that the general analysis, and it goes back to even the last year's gender composition report, participation of women is more inborn at the SBs during the technical negotiations. But there is drastic decline in participation at COPs. Mmenisikia? Na niliwaelezea what happens in June and what happens at COP. Nilisema COP ni policy, decision making. Na hapo ndio wanawake wana decline in terms of representation. So, and I'm not saying this is so for Kenya because I don't have the data, but let me just give the example in our Kenyan context. Means that in June, many of us who participated in the technical negotiations will not go to Baku, where the decisions are made. What does that mean? If you're not on the table, you're on the menu. So I think even as we discuss about issues, inclusion and participation, and remember, I've really highlighted that this is just on men, women, and here we are talking about inclusion. So if women decline in terms of participation at COPs, what does it mean for women with disabilities? What does it mean for women from marginalized communities, or young women, or girls? We talked about children. So older women, yes, all categories of women. So I think that is one thing that I just thought it's important to flag out, and I'm happy that our partners, ICASA, and some other partners have been encouraging, they have a program to support women with disabilities, which is a noble cause. But allow me to also play the devil's advocate. The fact that we take women with disabilities to court, like for instance, today we just say, okay, who is a woman with disability here and is interested in going to court, and they go. Does it mean automatic value add? So I would encourage us that we invest, and I think one of the speakers, the commissioner, mentioned about capacity building. I think we need to invest more in capacity building so that our different, interest groups, be it like women with disabilities, young women, women and men from marginalized and minority communities, have the capacity to engage effectively. So isikuwe tu ati tunatik list that now this year on our delegation we have 5 women with disabilities. They go to COP, they have no clue of what is happening and no clue on how to advance their plight as regards climate action, and then we say we are including them because there is the physical presence and there is the value addition. So I think with that, those are just some of the mandated events that will be happening at COP. There's already draft programs. So usually there's an agenda day. There's also a youth day at COP. So in terms of the gender day, there's planned to be a high-level dialogue on gender and transparency, and also there's going to be a technical in-session workshop, to deliberate on various issues. So I think I'll stop there. I hope you're more enlightened than you were. And those who I promised chocolates, you look for me after this. So thank you.
Let's appreciate our mom.